Kelly, thank you so much for joining us here in the lovely St Antony's College. This is an extraordinary presentation that you've pulled together. 1.7 billion people.
That's right, yeah.
That must be one of the biggest moments of democracy in democracy's history.
It is, and it actually underestimates the total number of people who had a chance to come out and vote.
Yeah.
We think there were over 2 billion people because in a number of states, some of those hybrid states like Russia,
Yeah.
they don't come out with their turnout numbers, so it's very difficult to get a proper estimate.
Yeah.
It is a big moment for democracy in 2024, but it was also a big moment, of course, for many populists across the world.
Yeah. So when you stand back and you look at those results, you can see some patterns like incumbents losing. What were the other patterns that struck you though?
When you look at what some of the key underlying issues were facing the citizens in the countries where an incumbent has been ultimately shifted out of power, you can look at some of the macro issues like inflation. Inflation is written large as a core issue for citizens in those countries, feeling like they have been left worse off than they were, say, 4 years ago during the previous electoral cycle. And as a result of some of those underlying issues that are not just in one country, but in many countries facing in the developed world, you have ultimately seen incumbents be considered to not be running states that are fit for purpose and not looking out for citizens in the future as well. And some of those sentiments impacted on their ability to win again.
Yeah. You see, this is so interesting because you've got a couple of things going on here. My particular interest, as you know, is the role of inequality in fueling some of the populist success. I was really struck by some numbers that you had in here that showed people just don't think elites are delivering for them.
That's right, yes.
And they're prepared to kind of blow them out of office almost.
Yes, indeed. We have looked at some concept called broken state, and we've looked at this.
So just unpack that a little bit. I thought that was I'd not come across that concept before.
Yes, so we have been asking people a series of statements over at least a decade now to try to get an understanding of whether they think the state is working for them or indeed the state is not working them. And it's statements like, this country's rigged for the rich and powerful, the elites are not working for people like me, etc. And when you look at those in aggregate and what's happening to citizen sentiment across a whole range of countries, France, the US, the UK, etc., you can see that actually over the last 10 years, there has been a majority of people who believe those statements are true, which means that they are saying they're more likely to believe that the state is broken than the state is working in their favour. And when that's the case, you have an optimal environment for populist sentiment to thrive, people who can offer an alternative to the state.
So do you think that there were more people last year who felt that states were broken than, say, I don't know, before the pandemic, say?
Well, interestingly, Liam, those numbers have been the same pretty much, give or take, up and down a little bit. France actually has dropped on those metrics, and indeed many of the populist leaders themselves have also been in their role for, in some cases, decades. So the leaders of the populist parties haven't necessarily changed. The feeling of the state is broken hasn't necessarily changed. But the competence of government, those metrics have really shot up, and we see that across a range of developed countries where people feel the state is not providing for them for the future, it's not helping to solve their problems, etc. And if you look here in the UK, even Keir Starmer has started talking about some of these issues where the Prevent programme didn't pick up. Some people who went on to commit some very serious crimes, the RAAC issues with schools, the waiting lists with the NHS, the water and the sewage, even down to potholes. These kind of issues are written large now in the public psyche. So whilst the populist leaders are the same, this sort of the economy is rigged for the elites, sentiment is high, but has been high for some time. The thing that has risen is that contextual factor about whether the state is actually a safe space and actually able to provide what the public need for the future.
So if confidence in state delivery has been low for a while, do you think people just ran out of patience, or do they now kind of look at the future and just think, actually, I'm now really pessimistic about what's going to happen next? It's time to press reset now.
I think when you look across some of the elections that took place last year, even looking at our own election, it wasn't that there was great favourability towards any of the political parties or those who may be considered to be the establishment per se. And the public, with having seen some of these challenges continue and indeed concern them more, so perhaps in 23 and 24, we're really willing to just roll the dice on not completely random people per se, but on giving their vote to people who are household names. So in the UK, Nigel Farage, Marie Le Pen in France. These are not people who've popped up yesterday. They've been around for some time. They've established themselves, and the public are at the point where they're saying, actually, a good proportion of them are saying, I'm happy to take a bit of a risk.
Yeah, this is what I've noticed on the doorstep, is that people feel like they've been pressing the reset button actually since the Brexit vote. And I think they're going to keep pressing the reset button until they feel things are beginning to change.
Well, they're going to have a moment now where they can actively see one very dominant populist leader with some very clear policy ideas. So they've got Donald Trump in office now in the US, and for many populist leaders around the world, and indeed many citizens who may have voted that way, they will be looking to see what can be delivered. Are these policies actually going to deliver what they have been articulated during the election campaign and by those leaders? So there's going to be a moment, a sort of proof point with populism written large at scale in the US, and some of the things that we're seeing around trade policies and immigration policies coming out of the US. Are they going to deliver, or are there going to be unintended consequences? And what will that do to populist sentiment around the world?
But in terms of messaging, when you look at Donald Trump's inauguration speech, he was pressing a lot of the buttons that you've highlighted here as real frustration points.
Yes.
Rage against the elites, state not working, obviously quite a sharp attack on foreigners, whether they're immigrants or foreign traders. He appears to have a message, a story that is in keeping with what people are feeling.
That's right. And when you think about public perception is their reality. And so if the public perceive that inflation is really high, even if it's not as high as it previously was, and even if their economy is growing, the US, prime example, they think inflation is high because they're not seeing the benefit yet to them personally. Donald Trump understood that when he was providing his narrative to that particular electorate. And whilst a number of populist leaders will have been written off by mainstream politicians in the years gone by, I think what we're going to be seeing now is actually, is there learning to take from the playbooks of populist leaders, things that actually help us to tap in a bit more to what the electorate truly are thinking and feeling, because they are not necessarily, some of the mainstream parties have missed their ability to do that over the last electoral cycle.
So storytelling is important.
Well, storytelling, but storytelling with understanding how the public actually perceive things from their perspective, rather than how you think they should perceive it, because the macroeconomic indicators are telling you one thing. If on the doorstep somebody is worried about whether or not they can afford to buy a loaf of bread or milk because of the rising in prices, that's how they perceive inflation, that's how they perceive the fate of the economy.
Yeah. Now, one of the other striking things for me from this brilliant presentation was that a lot of it was about economics and the numbers. It was about how well off people feel they're doing. It wasn't that they were just sort of reacting to perceptions of a wokeness that they just couldn't get on board with. It felt like it was coming down to, I'm not better off than I was before. I'm pessimistic about the future. Something's got to change here. I need a different kind of way to get better off, in a way.
Yes. And I do get asked a lot of times about some of because obviously culture wars is a major challenge in the US, and even here in the UK we see it on the rise, and we have seen it on the rise in some of the major newspapers in this country as well, in terms of the amount of airtime that it's getting. But when you go to the public, and we go to the doorstep every single month and we ask people, what do you think the big issues are facing the country today? What are the big issues facing you in your household? Those are not, those culture war issues that take up sometimes a fair amount of the broadsheets and the tabloid newspapers are not what the public are most concerned about. And when they're selecting a leader, for the UK, it was the NHS, it was the economy, it was immigration, and even for the US and France during their electoral events in 2024, it was inflation, it was immigration, and for those two countries it was also crime. So it's bigger, more fundamental issues that rise to the fore. It doesn't mean that people don't have cultural differences, and in fact we are seeing that rise in society as well, but it's an order of priority.
Yeah. So last question then. So if you think about the role of inequality, it's obviously changed a lot in the last 10 to 15 years. You've had quite low interest rates. That's been good if you were lucky enough to own assets. But For those who are dependent on, say, public services, the experience has been very different. So you can see in our culture now lots of stuff about the very wealthy, whether it's Succession or Parasite or Beloved, Above Deck, Below Deck. You can see.
Do you watch that, Liam?
Well, I had to research a book, and
Did you
know
really?
you become quite wrapped.
So I have watched it, not for researching a book.
But I mean, do you think there is a frustration born of people seeing some people doing terrifically well while their lives are hard? I mean, do you think that's part of what we need to understand in the rise of populism?
I think inequality is definitely one of the drivers, but it's not the only one. One of the biggest differentials we see in politics today is age. Now, those things are not independent of each other necessarily. You know, young people, poor backgrounds, more likely perhaps to definitely to vote a certain way, or to think they would lend their vote to a certain way, or be populism curious, as we might say.
Yes.
And so there is, but the age divide is more dominant in society today, and you can see that coming through in politics and lots of other different types of sentiment.
Yeah, perfect. Well, it's a brilliant presentation. Thank you so much for
hopefully
sharing with
I
it.
can convey it in a decent way this afternoon to
Kelly,
people who are listening. But
thank you so much.